To welcome our next speaker, Professor Shion Guha, who's coming in from the University of Toronto, where he's an assistant professor in the Faculty of Information and cross-appointed in the Department of Computer Science, and the director of the Human-Centered Data Science Lab. But more importantly, he was a guest speaker in the class that Deb and I co-taught in the fall, and managed to zoom in at the last minute when the immigration folks had some different ideas for his travel plans. So I'm very grateful to finally meet him in person and to have him here for our workshop. So,
okay. Thank you very much, Avi. Yeah, I just received my Canadian citizenship on Friday. And so I rush applied for a passport and got my passport yesterday morning and then took the night flight. So I'm still pretty woozy. The time difference and everything is messing with me. Okay, I'll be very quick. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces here. But for those of you who aren't really familiar with my work, I study algorithms in the public sector, so inside public agencies. This is not theoretical. This is absolutely as real as it gets. This is not professional researchers or statisticians or data scientists applying algorithms and making decisions. This is very untrained social workers and other street-level bureaucrats in the public sector. So it's a very real, very different type of work. So my work mostly has focused on the child welfare system. Today I want to take the workshop's bridging mandate very seriously. And I want to give you this thesis to start out with, that prediction cannot be separated from intervention when what you are predicting, which in the case of the public sector is often things like predictive risk models or risk, when that outcome label is produced by what is essentially an intervention system. Here's my central claim. Many predictive risk models and other similar risk models in areas like child welfare, homelessness, which is a real case study, by the way, benefits, unemployment, so on and so forth, they learn patterns of system contact, human discretion, and bureaucratic processes as much as they learn latent harm. So if we are not trying to think about modeling with all of those factors, all of those holistic factors in mind, then we are in trouble. We're actually not going to learn what we think we're going to learn. So I will ground this in practice through a case study that I've done for years in Wisconsin. And then after I moved to Canada, I've been kind of employing this in Ontario, Toronto, Ontario, Canada. So I'll start off with this central idea. Again, some of you may have seen some of these slides before, but I promise there are new ones here. In general, most predictive risk models in the public sector, this is a case study in child welfare, they're kind of like logistic regressions on steroids, right? So they're kind of like, you've got some type of an output, you've got some type of an input, some type of method. These are usually linear models, right? These are nothing very fancy. These are often built by nebulous third-party organizations that are contracted. They're the lowest common bidder, and therefore they get the contracts, and everybody loves public sector contracts because the money is not that much from any individual agency, but once you get the money forever. That's one of the biggest secrets in the public sector. So if we look at child welfare in general, and I'll be very brief, generally speaking, we don't have to zoom in too much, but if you look at the scary red parts of this figure, what we see is that essentially all of the things that are being predicted are things like risk assessments and risk. Risk of maltreatment, risk of neglect, risk of referral, risk of placement stability. These are all concepts in social work, and this is what is broadly being predicted. And then if we look at what's kind of going into these models, we generally see it's things we don't want. Things like demographics and some nebulous idea of children mental health and risks of a child and child needs and strengths and all of that stuff. And then we kind of, when we look at what methods are actually being employed, it's no surprise we're seeing, and I separated this out in supervised machine learning, even though these two things are a little conflated, but generally these are all GLMs. These are all logit models, tobit models, probit models, so on and so forth. So that's the state of the world that we're in. I have replicated this across in a couple of other sectors like homelessness and public higher education, and this pattern, this idea persists. This is pretty persistent. So I'll kind of jump into this long-term ethnographic fieldwork that I did. So in my lab, we end up doing all kinds of things. On one hand, we do these types of detailed ethnographic studies punctuated with other deep qualitative investigations with semi-structured interviews and other things. We also do pretty hardcore statistics work, which I will talk about in a moment. But in general, when I kind of look at this is the figure that everybody likes to see. We kind of mapped what child welfare looks like. This is in Wisconsin. This is quite it translates to context pretty well. And this is how complicated it actually is. And the problem with data scientists and statisticians, I'm a statistician by training, by the way, so I'll lump myself into this. The problem is that we don't understand these processes. What we're given usually is dumps of administrative data, lots and lots of different types of data that's given to us, and statisticians love to talk about linked data and all of those good things. None of those data actually account for the complexities that actually occur within a system. And I'll point your attention to the things in the red boxes. This is where the algorithms are actually used. And so you'll see in a real world case study here, there's not one algorithm that's being employed at any one time. There's multiple types of algorithms, and that they're employed over a period of time. I will also point out that this temporal linearity is also flattened and a little simplified. But even in this simplicity, you'll see that there's a lot of stuff that happens. So real people are doing real work in child welfare. Nobody is sitting around and not doing anything. So you'll see here that these are the different types of things that any algorithm here is trying to predict. This persists across to Ontario as well in my current case study, because a lot of the companies that sell these types of products, these types of analytics tools, there's only 2 or 3 of them, including a couple of Silicon Valley startups, and they sell across to North American agencies. Okay, so based on all of this, we kind of came up with this theoretical framework, right? How do people actually make decisions from algorithmic outputs on the ground? I won't go into it in too much detail because I want to get to other things. But essentially, there's 3 main factors. There's the idea of human discretion. This is very important. Anybody who studies sociology knows that human discretion or agency, the act of choosing to do a thing or having the power to not do a thing, is extremely important. Or to consider a factor or not consider a factor, very important. And that has all kinds of other stuff around it, like their professional expertise and value judgments and like the heuristics that are actually used in places like child welfare to make decisions. Then you've got things like bureaucratic processes. So you've got things like resources and constraints that any organization has, so on and so forth. And then obviously you have the actual process of making the decision itself. Here's my main takeaway from all this particular theoretical framework. The idea is very simple. So we see, especially from the previous figure, that there's a lot of dynamics and complexities that exist in this type of world. And if we treat these dynamics as noise or random error or error that we can't ever deal with because it's inconvenient as statisticians to do so, then that's a problem. Then we fundamentally misspecify the problem. It's a fundamental misspecification of problems. But if we start to model some of these as part of the data generating and thinking about processes, then I think we can start to bridge prediction and intervention more honestly than we do right now. So let me jump into the next thing. So one of the things I figured out was that, in all of these algorithms that are used, it's primarily based on administrative data. Data that's kind of quantitative data that's collected about children, about people, and then we kind of model them. But it turns out that that's a minority of the data that exists in these places. And really, the vast majority of data are narrative data, like textual data, narratives that are written about every case. This is particularly prevalent in child welfare, but also carries over into other parts of the public sector. Every single case that comes before a particular street-level bureaucrat has tons of text written about it. So a few years ago, we said, okay, let's do a very naive analysis. Now, this isn't anything fancy, right? I'm sure many of you can do better analysis than this. But this is a very naive what I would call a very participatory computational analysis, right? So we said, okay, let's start with a very naive LDA-style topic model on these types of like vast amounts of narrative data. And let's not interpret any of the data, because what do I know about child welfare? I'm not an expert. I know nothing about social work. Instead, what if we kind of bring in people, the social workers, the folks who are actually engaged in the work of making decisions, what if we kind of bring them into the fold and they do the act of interpretation work? This then kind of branched off into this whole thing around participatory design of AI, et cetera, that I don't want to get into, like a whole methodological thing. But at the end of the day, we kind of worked with the actual public sector employees. And this is what I really want to show. The original paper is a lot more than this, but this is what I want to show. So if you do some type of statistical mumbo jumbo and kind of like, flatten a case into this normalized kind of time interval, right? So this x-axis is essentially a life of a case. So a child enters the system, and then they exist out of the system. So if you've got some type of normalization, and if you layer the different types of interpreted topic probabilities on top of it, what do you actually learn? And you start to learn some really interesting things. So for instance, in this case here, we see that parents, those whose children are now in foster care, they have to complete mandatory parenting assessments by the state. And the completion of the parenting assessment actually gives the state enough information whether or not the parent is now a competent parent, whether or not a child should be kind of given back to them. And this normally isn't some type of a survey. Oftentimes, this is observational work. Social workers will go, work with you, look at what the parent is doing, talk to the parent, see if they can care for the child, so on and so forth. And so you start to see that at particular points of time when the parenting assessments are completed, you can kind of get signals of those. You can kind of see, okay, what is actually happening? Can we actually look at this narrative data? Can we develop these topics? Can we figure out when the parenting assessments are completed? And in general, we can. So usually a parenting assessment is completed a little bit into the case and then at the end of the case. And kind of these two assessments are looked at as an adjudication of whether a parent is competent or not. So the idea is that we are able to kind of decipher some of these signals. The other types of signals that we're able to decipher are things that we would call, in the NLP literature, we would call computational power analysis. But what I want to point out is narratives do not merely describe events, right? So in the previous slide, I talked about events, parenting assessment that's being completed, but they also allocate, and this is the important part, they allocate agency and authority. How a text is written kind of provides us with a lot of clues down the line about what's actually going on. And so here we see, this is for medium needs, this is for short-term foster care. We see that foster parents exercise, the green lines over here means you have more narrative power. Foster parents exercise more narrative power. And when we kind of dig deeper into the text, what we really see is that caseworkers must maintain good relationships with short-term foster parents. This is very different from long-term foster parents. It's a very different dynamic. But we kind of see what these dynamics look like. The sad part is the child has absolutely no narrative power. You can see here, negative. But you can start to get little pieces of signals from the text. And so if models are trained on these narratives, right? Like we can ask ourselves a question, okay, let's not deal with administrative data. Let's look at narrative data. You just said narrative data is the most amount of data in these systems. Let's look at narrative data and let's do all our statistical analysis of the narrative data. The problem is, if models are trained on these narratives without an underlying theory of power, then what you risk is you risk automating a particular institutional standpoint rather than supporting equitable decision making. The goal is not to produce a singular number about a child to then make a decision. The goal is to support decision making. Because like it or not, I know that popular media narratives are very different about child welfare. The vast majority of child welfare cases actually have decent positive outcomes. But current models don't really ask the questions of positive outcomes. They ask the question of minimizing risk. And those two things are not the same at all. So if we then kind of start looking at some theory, so I just spoke about some theory, if we then start looking at some theory around power and risk and all of that stuff, we see that, there's all of these things that we can get from case narrative, right? There are things like critical decisions and circumstances around those decisions and uncertainties and interactions and day-to-day functioning. You can get all of that stuff. And when you layer it against existing theory from Austin et al., we see that instead of flattening to a singular number or a particular kind of causal claim, there's actually a lot more that goes on under the hood. So there are things like risk factors, but then there are also things like protective factors, things that caseworkers, foster parents do in order to protect the child. And if you build these types of, logit type GLMs that are prevalent right now, then they're not really going to work very well because they don't account for these types of issues. So we kind of continued that analysis, and this is a kind of like a 2-year timescape. We kind of took a 2-year timescape. I know this is right during COVID, and you could ask the question whether COVID changed anything. I can talk more about that later. But essentially, if you kind of look at the narrative data and you kind of start looking at the risk factors in the narrative data and plot it on a curve, you see that risk factors are not like a uniform distribution, right? So it's not like some type of like a straight line. Risk is not a consistent singular value. Rather, risk for any random case has all of these peaks and troughs. So what does that mean practically for a child? It means that in general, you can see here, in general, we start out with pretty high risk when a child enters the system. That's why they're in the system. You enter high risk. And then people do things, but then the risks don't automatically disappear. A child has to go through a whole lot of different things during their time in the system. There's other trauma and other stuff that happens. So you see these peaks and troughs. Yes? This is on an average.
Okay, so when you're talking about a child entering this, I guess is this saying for a child entering it in October 2020 versus, I can't remember.
No, this is for all of the cases from June 2019 to December 2021. So all of the completed cases. And so when you kind of start looking at the risk factors for all of those cases and take an average and kind of look at what risk factors look like, you'll see that they have this pattern. And if you isolate any one child, like if you look at any one child's case, you'll see a similar pattern here too. Okay. So the risk factors that are surfaced from narrative data, my point is that it's temporally situated. It's not like a one value. And yes?
Sorry, so this is not showing changes in the risk profile over time?
No. It is narrative, it is risk factors that come from theory that underlie narrative data, with the assumption that the narrative data, the things that are being written about somebody, are in some way, shape, or form more comprehensive of the underlying circumstances around decision making than administrative data, which is kind of recording kind of little snapshots in a period of time. That's a fantastic question. Yes.
Maybe a quick follow-up question is: it's surprising that there's, or maybe it's not surprising that there's so much temporal structure, but maybe a follow-up question is: a lot of criticism of child welfare algorithms relate to how it's more about poverty or structural factors. Does this reflect like macroeconomic shifts or structural factors versus individual level risk factors?
Amazing question. So this is just one part of the layer. So this is risk factors. Let me layer protective factors on top of that. And protective factors are things that caseworkers do. And what we start seeing here, and when you look at the data, you'll realize that these protective factors have peaks that almost always occur before the peaks of the risk factors. And when I talk to the caseworkers with the specific events, and I said, why are you doing a particular thing over here? They say that, actually, we understand that a child is going to experience an adverse event, and so if we don't do a particular thing, this peak will be higher. It's very interesting. So then when you layer on what you were talking about, systemic factors, you realize that systemic factors are consistent. It exists, right? So none of this is a commentary on the systemic issues that exist in our society, right? Like none of these things can ever address that. If you come from poverty-stricken background, then that exists. That's an underlying thing. No algorithmic outcome is ever going to change that. But it is part of this broader theoretical framework. And then you also have things like, I know it's hard to see, something called a procedural factor, which is administrative things that the state does. But the important piece here I'd like to direct everyone's attention to is the fact that there's a lot more that happens in a system than trying to predict risk. And we kind of, these start to look like evolving signatures of decisions, evolving kind of like understandings of exactly what is it that people do. And so many risk predictions then are better understood as predictions of intervention trajectories, right? So can risk be a outcome in part of things that people do to try and mitigate that risk? It's a very interesting question. So let's, yes.
So two quick clarifications. One, I think, following up on what Eli was asking about, I should understand this as there are children entering the system at like time zero for a given child. Could be anywhere on this.
No. We actually specifically just, in order to not deal with those randomness, we specifically looked at children who were, because there's so many children entering, you can actually get a lot of cases of children entering exactly in this June.
That was, I think,
and then leaving here.
That was, I think, some part of the question earlier.
Yes, it's a complete data set,
Right, I understand. So everyone in this snapshot starts in June 19? I see. And then the other thing, and I think maybe I asked this when you presented this in our class, but I couldn't quite remember. I'm a little surprised that there are spikes in 2020, but not at the start of the pandemic.
So the interesting thing, this is what I was going to talk about. Everyone asks the pandemic question. What happened was, in Wisconsin, child welfare is privatized. Also privatized partly in California, if you didn't know. So, and this is a thing that a lot of folks don't know. Essentially, services in child welfare are outsourced to private agencies. Usually nonprofit, but they're outsourced. And then in Wisconsin, there are two big agencies. And the previous, when we were doing this work, this was the outcome of the 10-year regime of the Scott Walker administration. What they did was this very Ayn Randian survival of the fittest type of war between the two agencies that would get contracts. So the two agencies were forced to compete with each other and come up with innovations and all of those things. And so one of the things that happened at the start of the pandemic over here was that child welfare immediately jumped to online settings. So what they did was they, instead of doing at-home visitations, et cetera, they started doing online virtual visitations. They also started doing like outside visitations in the park and all of those things. They're very quick to change. I don't know, I've heard anecdotally in New York that the New York City system did not change. But in Wisconsin, they were very nimble, maybe because there's less number of cases compared to New York. I mean, the whole child welfare sector in the US is really bad. I mean, it's bad everywhere, but it's really bad. But maybe this is a function of a slightly smaller state like Wisconsin. That's very much possible.
And also just.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so let's jump to the last part. So what I did was, very recently, we kind of translated all of these findings to Ontario. Started working with Children's Aid Society, which is the relevant big, this is a government agency. So in Canada, it is not privatized. It's all government agencies. And this is I just like to plug my students. But basically, the Human Rights Commission of Canada, they had this huge thing about concerns about risk assessment standards and tools in child welfare. If you read the whole thing, they're lambasting all of these data analytics tools that are being used, and this is also the beginning of LLM use in child welfare, which is the next thing that I'm coming to. And so, when we started working with Children's Aid Society, they came and said, look, we're getting a lot of pressure from the provincial government. They're telling us to use LLMs. And LLMs are going to save the day when it comes to child welfare. They're going to do all of this narrative work for us. Your vanilla LDA and NNMF models are bad, and ChatGPT is the way to go. So this is when we had a great opportunity. And we said, hang on. Let's try to answer this broader question. So, in general, we hold things like drug discovery and other kinds of scientific advances to a pretty high standard of rigor when it comes to evidence. How is it that we never ask the same question about AI, especially when we want to use them in high-stakes decision-making contexts like this? So if the government says, let's use ChatGPT to make decisions about child welfare, is this not like a really interesting idea? Like, can we hold AI to the same level, to the standards as vaccine discovery or drug discovery? It's an interesting question. And so the reason why this is very hard to answer is because when any plan hits the ground, then everything falls apart. And so Children's Aid Society was very interested. They said, okay, let's do this. Let's try to figure out if we can take LLM or AI implementation in a public sector agency and evaluate it rigorously with respect to causal inference frameworks or RCT-style frameworks. This is still ongoing. I actually would really welcome collaborations if people are really interested. But what I wanted to point out, so there's some issues, like bigger philosophical issues that I'm happy to discuss. But they have some issues, like they didn't, obviously I flippantly mentioned ChatGPT. They actually don't want ChatGPT. They want like a local implementation. The problem is there's only a few kind of local LLMs that are not really trained on other types of data that then you have to train. So there's all of these computational questions that arise. Regardless, the main thing that I want to come to is that child welfare agencies want to ensure that workers are providing effective services, right? And the most important thing that they're concerned is long-term case backlog. This is the number one thing. Again, we're trying to support decision-making, not make predictions. So here's the big thing. So we start doing some of this, okay, can LLMs help, etc. I want to direct everyone's attention to this red line. This is the big takeaway. Essentially, we see that LLMs kind of perform okay for tracking service plans with respect to outcomes, but only for short and medium-sized cases. If you start looking at the long and extreme cases, which is this red line over here, then LLMs completely fall apart and they don't work well at all. And these are the cases that caseworkers actually need help with. Caseworkers do not need help with short cases. They have enough heuristics to deal with a lot of simplified cases. But what they really want is these long-term extreme cases that have issues. And so there's more stuff about this over here that I'm happy to talk about. But here are my main takeaways, right? My big takeaways for this workshop. Risk models often learn the intervention systems, not necessarily latent harms, but also latent harms, obviously. And so we see that administrative outcomes are often system contact labels, things that people do, and which are produced by other factors around them. Narrative records can surface this intervention work with constraints and other power, et cetera, which predictive risk models can erase. The meaning of risk, therefore, is temporal and process dependent, and static risk scoring, which is the norm right now, actually collapses this human dynamics. LLMs do not solve this in long, complex cases. Maybe in the future it can, but reliability declines as uncertainty and case entropy arises. So that's my big takeaway over here. What I'll stop with by saying is that this is my thank you slides. What I'll say is that I invite anybody in the workshop, if you are interested in collaborating about intervention-aware modeling and evaluation in real-world cases, if you want to get into the messiness of working with public agencies, et cetera, it's a very hard statistical problem. Let's work together, but hopefully you got some decent takeaways. I think I am on time, yes? Okay. Thank you. Okay.
All right. Let's get one or two questions. Yes.
So, absolutely fascinating stuff, and I'm really interested in, and I'll talk some about this tomorrow, this idea of risk and essentially intervention conditional risk. But one way in which we think about it in the homelessness domain is often just take the least aggressive intervention you can and predict whatever the outcome you're interested in measuring under that sort of the baseline intervention. and use that as kind of the baseline risk, and then think about sort of more intensive interventions as, okay, now you can measure sort of, how much are you improving from the baseline risk or something like that. So is there a notion of like, what even outcomes would be reasonable to think about baseline risk in the child welfare kind of setting, right? In homelessness, we often just think about sort of return to homelessness within the next 2 years or something like that. But is it medical emergencies? Is it other kinds of stuff? Like what are you measuring?
Yeah, in child welfare it's complicated because 95% of cases are maltreatment, not abuse. The media focuses a lot on abuse, but abuse is 5% of overall cases in child welfare. This is generally across most jurisdictions in North America. So 95% is actually maltreatment, which is often things that can be, if you give parents decent training and if you give enough education to the child and other support, then usually they can kind of get out of it. Here's the issue though, the maltreatment cases are those short cases which the caseworkers are able to support, and therefore they don't need any computational help. They don't need any computational help for short-term maltreatment stuff, which is the majority of the cases that they face. The problem is those minority of the cases, the 5%, are those extreme long-term cases that are very thorny, very problematic. And the caseworkers do not agree on those extreme kind of that long tail of those cases. And that's where the government, particularly in Ontario, is really pressuring them. The government is telling them, deal with your long-term cases. Why do you have cases that are open for 18 months, 24 months, 36 months? That's where they need support, but that's also the minority of the cases that they see. So it's a weird dynamic that kind of plays out, and I don't think many of the caseworkers agree with this. I mean, honestly, the most agreement I've seen is they'll just say, okay, if the government would fund child welfare better, then we would solve many of these long-term problems. But clearly that's not happening, whether that's in the US or whether it's in Canada. So
Let's take maybe one more question while Asia sets up. Anyone else? Yes, last question.
hello.
I was curious if you correlated or looked at correlations of that risk factor chart with the case data for COVID to try and understand some of the how COVID affected it. Because if I look at it, it looks almost identical to Wisconsin's case curve.
Yeah, it could. We haven't actually done that. We didn't correlate that with COVID. So I can't really answer that question, but that is probably something interesting to look at. Thank you.
All right, well, let's thank our speaker again. That was great.
Thanks.
Say allow there.
It's on the wrong thing.
I'm supposed to remind you. Oh, sorry. As an organizer, I'm obligated to. All right, thank you. Okay. All right, well, let's get our next speaker gets set up. I will get her bio.
So if you hit allow, I think you can choose.
All right, so our last speaker for the morning is Professor Aisha Williams. She is the Lister Brothers Career Development Assistant Professor at MIT. But I think more importantly for me, she's an alum of the Berkeley Statistics Department. And so this is a nice homecoming for her, and we're very grateful that she's joining us today.
Great, thank you. I know I'm the only person standing between us and the rest of our days, poster session and then the rest of our days, so I'll try and keep this brief. This is not the